Hello, and welcome to part 4 of building a CMDB integration. My name is Nick Ryan, and today we're going to create the data sources for our integration. If we look back at this ingestion pipeline quickly, what we're going to actually build today are these first two components down here. We're going to create some integration hub actions, which will feed into our data source. And once we have all that and the data is easily retrievable from the third-party system, then that will feed into the integration hub ETL tool, which we will cover in the next episode. So let's see what it's about in terms of building out the data sources. So we need to understand what options are available to us for data sources. And then as we start to look at the integration hub capabilities, we want to understand what is different between a REST action and a data stream. And then we'll actually get to creating the data sources. So first, what are our options? And we'll see this when we start building it out, but when we open up a data source, we can choose JDBC calls, just uploading some files. We're going to mainly be using actually the custom script option, but we will talk about the REST and data stream action options as well. So as point number 2 says there, and we'll see this in more depth, there's a lot of similarity between the REST action and a data stream action. The biggest difference is really that a data stream action is one that will continuously make calls based on pagination capabilities of an API you're using, and continue to stream that data in chunks. The REST action really is just going to make a single call out and return whatever response body it gets. So it may be subject to size limitations, like 5 megabytes, I believe, or things like that. Another important consideration or design point to understand is that there will be a data source for each query that we make. So for every different API endpoint that we have to hit on the Kong gateway to get data about it, each of those will be its own data source. So we'll have one for the gateway, then Workspaces, and so on. And so hopefully at this point too, we'll be referring back to this source analysis quite a bit, because as we see in this middle column here, these are all the different data sources that we're actually going to define. And so at the end of this, this is what we're going to have set up. And so I'll probably actually only go through 2 or 3 of these, part of the recording, but then we'll show and talk about all of them that'll be built out at the end. So to start, let's take a look at what is running quickly as far as like the environment that I'm building against. So I'm just working off of my own Mac here. There's a couple of containers that are running the actual Kong gateway, and then I have a containerized mid server so that I can actually access the gateway on my Mac. And so when we look into the actual instance now, here's my mid server that's up and running. Again, this is only required if the ServiceNow instance cannot get to the data source. So in this case, a ServiceNow instance can't talk directly to my Mac behind our firewalls and things like that. So I have to have a mid server running to facilitate the communications. So now that we've got that, I'm actually going to make sure that we switch into our scope, because we want to capture all of these changes in the scope that we made in the last episode. So the now Kong gateway scope is what we're going to be working in. Switch to that. And if you haven't already done so, you may want to make a set of favorites that you'll be working with commonly throughout this. I'll bring up my list here in a second. But things like the data sources, integration hub ETL, flow designer, and so on. So the first thing we're going to actually do is have to define a connection and credential alias, because this is going to specify which gateway that we are going to develop against. So these are some of the out-of-the-box ones. Let's come in here and create new. We'll just give it a name, call gateway alias. I'm gonna leave it as an HTTP connection type, and it's going to be both a connection and credential alias. I'll leave the default retry policy on there as well. Save that. And now we're gonna specify a new connection. So this connection is actually going to be to that containerized gateway that's running on my local laptop. So here we can say call gateway. In reality, you'd probably specify a basic auth credential. This admin API that's running right now on this system doesn't require a credential, but most systems will have a credential of some sort, so you can easily come in and create a credential as well. So for the connection URL, how it works when it's running on my laptop is specify it this format. So this is basically saying this is the admin API port. So if I were to connect to it through like a CLI, it would be the same type of port. And I'm gonna say, yep, I gotta use a mid server. I know I've only got one running on this system. You could do all kinds of things with specifying what capabilities it needs if you only want to narrow it down to a certain one. And double check this domain because I want to make sure that we're capturing this connection alias in our Kong application. Actually, I believe it is. Well, let's save this and double check it. I will come back and validate that at some point, but let's keep moving on. So we've got our connection alias defined. Here's the actual alias name, and this is actually in our scope. So now at this point, what we're gonna do, and I'll go ahead and open up the flow designer because this will be the next step. But while that's opening it up, I'm actually going to come into the data sources so we can talk about this for a second. So you see all of these are mostly just example ones that come with the system out of the box. When we click on a new one, I won't actually save it at this point in time, or we can just leave it open. But this is where we start to see those different options around what we can do. So we talk about JDBC, LDAP and OIDC are mostly for like user integrations. The REST, Integration Hub REST action, Integration Hub data stream. If you pick one of these, it's really going to then give you an option of where to put that in. And so after you've defined one, you can specify it there. Like I say, most of ours, we're gonna do the custom load by script. So I'll leave that there and we can come back to it here in a second. To get started though, we talked about what's the difference between a REST action and a data stream action. So when we click on the actions, we're going to get different types of actions that we can, or different steps that we can do within an action. Whereas a data stream, if we choose that option, it's really going to be expecting a REST endpoint, and there's preset steps that you can really do in there, and you can't really add as many. So we're going to start out and let's go ahead and for ours, we're going to say, let's get Kong gateway. See, this is our scope, this application. We can leave these default settings here. In reality, you probably want to give it some more descriptions to understand what the usage of it is, maybe what the input variables are, and so on. go ahead and create our first action. So here we are, got that. So what we're going to really want to do and how we're going to identify our COM gateway is through that connection alias that we just created. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to pass in a connection alias. And that's going to be a reference to connection alias. Connection and credential alias, there it is. Have to have that, so let's make it mandatory. So this is where we can get, when you click this plus sign, it's going to give us a series of options of different steps that we can take. Most of these are just on platform, interacting with ServiceNow data. And so this script option is very powerful if you haven't used it before, but we're going to go ahead and say, let's just make a REST call. So here, I'm going to say get info route. And so if I quickly look over at the documentation for this, an information route, and so I'm on the COM site, you can see it just takes the slash. And here's an example payload, which doesn't look like it really has a pagination variable in here that would show me like if there's more data. So that we will specify our connection alias that we created. So what this really allows us to do is as we move between environments, we don't have to come in and change these actions. We just change the connection definition on the alias. And so all of the actions that are using this alias will inherit that new host if you're actually pointing from, say, a dev instance to production instance. So very important that we use that. And really what we want to do here is, I don't know that I want to actually pick that one because it may change. What if you've got multiple instances of COM gateways? So as we'll see when we get to making the data source, if I pass it in and then I use this variable, then I can change that dynamically through the script load that we'll use. I'm going to go ahead and leave this resource path blank because it doesn't need one, as we saw in the documentation. The error evaluation is an optional step, but can be good for handling errors differently, or maybe normalizing them into consistent codes or things like that. I'm not going to go too in depth on that, outside the scope of what we're trying to do. But then the last step is we do have to create an output. So let's say that we want to create a response. This response is actually going to be a big JSON blob. So let's go ahead and tell it to be JSON. And then if we exit out of this, what we're really going to do is just map the entire response body into that. So what's going to happen is it's going to make that REST call to that endpoint, and then whatever the response body back is, provide that output. Now, as you see here, you can provide back the status codes or error codes or things like that. So that can be useful outputs as well. Again, I'm not going to go into depth too much on that, but let's go ahead and save this. And once it's saved, you can see there's a test button here, very useful. Then because this was an input variable that we said had to be there, we have to provide our alias I want, the COM gateway alias, and then let's run the test. Then you can check. What this is really going to do is let us know that, hey, we're actually connecting to the source and we are getting data back. So it says code is 0 is a success. click on the response body, we see the whole payload that came back. So great, we know that we are connecting to our data source. That's great. Close all that, close this. At this point, we can go ahead and say, let's publish it. Publishing means that it can actually be used by the platform. So once you've published it, now we can actually call it from our data source. Start making some headway there. So we've got that. I'm going to go ahead and maybe make one more action while we're in here. And so a quick and easy way to start doing that is actually to, if you've got one that you know is going to be very similar, you can say, all right, well, let's come in here and copy this action. So all of our actions are actually going to be very, very similar, just a little bit different on the endpoint. So here, I'm going to say, the second one we're going to do is we are going to get Kong workspace. And once I copy that, then I don't have to go through some of the steps. Like if I'm always going to pass in that connection alias variable to start out with, I don't have to continue to do that over and over. So here it is, and good to go. In this one, I actually know that I'm going to need one more variable. If I come and look at the documentation for the workspaces, what you'll see is that's actually the post, but if I go down to listing workspaces, it's a get call against this endpoint. Excuse me. And here's some sample output. If I go to the bottom, one thing I notice is that there's a next. This next actually means that this API may paginate. So I need to account for that. And so in this particular case, I know that I'm going to want to pass in an offset variable, because that's going to be what comes in that. We're going to have to change this to actually be get workspaces, as we saw. And we know that that endpoint is actually from the documentation, it was /workspaces. So if I put /workspaces, and then what I actually want to do after that is provide this offset value, because, and we'll see, come back and see what that really means in a second. Again, not going to touch much in the way of error evaluations. And again, our response body is really what we want there. So we can save this. We can test it. Again, don't have to give it the offset, but we'll see how that plays out. And let's check this out. All right, success. So here, there's only one in my test setup, and it's the default one. So that's correct. There's a bunch of information about it, but that's the one. If we look in here at all our workspaces, I only have this one called default. Close that. Let's go ahead and publish this as well. While that's publishing, I'm going to actually go over to back to the data sources, and let's start building our first one. So the first one we saw was that it was a Kong gateway, and I'll just call this the thing, and it automatically populates the import set table name. And so here, there's a number of variables that we'll explore as we get into this. I'll make this a full screen. And for the sake of not, the one thing that we actually will need from this is going to be our connection and credential alias that we created, we're going to need the sys of that guy. Oh, I'm going to come back in and grab that quickly. Copy the sys. Let's come back in here. This. So I'm going to build this out a little bit slowly the first time, and then we'll speed along after this. Always good to put in, and it's really good if you would put all this into a script include to encapsulate it and then make calls to that from here. But for the sake of speed, I'm going to skip the script include step. So our alias ID is that one I just copied. And then we can basically, well, the first step we want to do is get the glide record for that. And if we actually get one of those, start to build out. So what we're going to do at this point is we've queried for that connection alias record, because it's a reference. Remember, in our flow designer action, we made it a reference to that record, which means we need to pass the entire record in. There are certainly some other ways of doing that, and I know there's obviously some other ways of making these queries with get value and things along those lines. So code at your own preference. I wouldn't say this is the best practice on coding techniques, but see how this works. We're actually going to now build the inputs for that REST action that we created. So I'm going to say inputs, and then our first one was called connection alias. So if I go back into Flow Designer, I open back up this one, and we look here. So connection alias, this was the variable that I'm trying to populate now. So connection alias equals our glide record that we just queried for. And that was the only one that we had. So one thing that you can also do in Flow Designer, if you don't already know this, is actually get a code snippet. So you can come into this little related list over here and say, create code snippet. What it'll do is it'll show you how you can actually call this from a connection. So here, like we said, right, the connection alias inputs, and then it's really this line that's kind of long and confusing, but I'll go ahead and get these two lines from it. And then back in here. A nice thing, we can clean that up right there. Click that. So now at this point, what it's done is it's called our get column gateway action. It's passed in the inputs, and off we go. Got some outputs here, and we can start to use this at this point if we want to. There's some other things you can do with this import set table record and some of the other things in here. I'm not going to go crazy in depth on them, but if you want to preset the column names, there is like an import record that add column capability. So if we start to type import record in here, you'll see that there's a few different things in here that you can do. And so I would explore some documentation on that if you want. Again, I'm not gonna go too crazy on these in this video. I'm gonna just initialize the import record here. and then we can start to populate it with things that we know are in the payload. So if you just start to type these in, we'll see how these names of this object are going to translate into the import set. They'll usually be actually prefixed with a U underscore. One step I forgot to do actually up here is to code our actual response body, because remember, it's just the entire giant response body we want to get response. So again, if we go back to our flow designer message, or our flow designer here, we see that this is actually called response. So it's important that it matches this in terms of like capitalization and all those things. It needs to be the exact same name. And so I'm going to decode that. So now I can use this object and start to just pull out values that I know exist in the payload, which again, you can see either in the documentation or, you know, if you've played around with it in Postman or so on. So in the documentation, you know, there's like a host name, node ID, plugins, versions, so on. So you can look at it that way, but sometimes it's not a comprehensive list there. So probably best to play around with it and see what dating you need. And it also does come back to our mapping, column gateway mapping. Here again, these are the fields that I know that I want to get. And so you can also should be able to use that to specify these values. For the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead here, and I have a lot of this already out. Pick that up. Go. And so you see there's a number of these that I'm getting out of that payload, the values, the connection ID, alias that we want. And then basically we insert into this overall parameter the value that we want. Double checking all this because it looks like something maybe is awry. There we go. So should be good there. One, save it. So now we have our first data source in our application. It's making a call to the action, and we're good to go. You can actually test it here by running a test load of some records or all the records. I'll save that for another day, but let's work on one more of these just to give you another example. And even beyond that, data sources, we can actually start there again and just take and copy all of that over. I will expedite some of the typing on this next one because not terribly fun to watch, but I will talk through code on this other one that I'm going to do. So the second, we made that other one that was for the workspaces. And so let's go ahead and create that one here as well. E-column workspaces. And again, we're going to use load by script. And so this is really maybe a better example of how the custom load by script can be a little bit more useful. So there's a lot in this one. If we actually, again, one more time, different one. What this is doing, same thing. So I'm going through and getting the glide record because that was one of our inputs, obviously. And then so was the offset value, was another one. But you'll notice what's different, and one of the big differences in this is that I have this do loop. And so this do loop will exist in all the remaining data sources because all of the remaining API calls we're going to make support that pagination and have this concept of an offset. And so you'll see that this is actually going to be saying here, this is, so check out that one, make sure we get the same name on that, create the code snippet. So we're going to pass those two variables in, do the same type of thing, got to decode the entire response body. But here we're looking for that offset. So if the next value, again, workspaces, documentation, listing workspaces, if next is null, then there's no more data to get. But if it's not null, it will have this offset value in basically a URL. And so we want to parse that offset value and what's after it, because what's after it is it's a little, looks like a sysid effectively. So, so we set up this regex up here to basically look for the offset value in that string. We're saying if the next value isn't null, then go ahead and match it against that and create this offset value to pass in. And then the other part to know about this, if we look at the workspaces, is that it's actually an array. So there's this data array that we then need to scroll through. So what we have after we've gotten the response body is that we then need to go through that data array and bring in each record in the array. And so that's why we have this little for loop to handle going through the array. Here, there's not much that we're going to get except for a name and an ID. And again, we want to pass in this connection alias so that we know which gateway we're talking to. So at this point, that's really it. We've created a data source for the workspaces as well now. And so this same type of pattern is going to happen over and over. So at this point, I'll actually going to pause the recording, and we'll come back once I've created all the remaining ones. Okay, so we're back, and now we have all of our data sources defined, and each of these 8 data sources has a corresponding flow designer action associated with it. So I'm going to get in here very quickly and actually show one nuance about these that we did the gateway and the workspace together, but now the rest of these actually have a little bit of a twist in that they are actually going to provide an option if you don't want to import a certain workspace. So what we're actually going to do is introduce a new loop into this where we're going to loop through all the workspaces that we loaded in that other step and then follow the same pattern after that and call it. But what this allows us to do is say in this load balancer request, we can pass in the workspaces, only the workspaces that we actually want to pull back. So things to consider when you're interacting with APIs like in the case of Kong, this actually isn't required. I could just query directly against the upstreams and it'll give me all of them on the gateway. But if you want to control things a little bit more, then look for some of these additional parameters to work with. And so the last thing I'll show before we wrap this up is we've got all of our data sources loaded. Probably a good idea if we actually save them somewhere. So we briefly touched on in the third episode how to create this app and the fact that we can link it to source code. So now once we've saved some of our changes, this is really a valuable part of doing it and working within a scoped application is this step. Once App Engine Studio opens up here, we'll see here's our Kong Gateway app. And once this summary page opens, you'll see for source control, I want to commit the changes. So I've already associated it with my GitHub repo. And now I just want to commit the changes. So I'll come in here. I really review them all, but let's go ahead and continue. Comment. First, commit with data sources defined. And we will commit all those. At this point, we've gone through, created our data sources and our flow designer actions. So we should be having the ability to get our data flowing into the system. And in the next episode, we will actually use that data to start building our transforms and our integrations in the Integration Hub ETL. So until then, good luck with building your data sources.